Chuck Berry was a pioneer in his field, often referred to as the father of rock and roll, who influenced a generation of musicians.
Why don't you carry your own band? So now I am. There was reasons for me not to back in the 60s.
Chuck Berry didn't just help invent rock and roll, he ruled it with uncompromising authority. While his duck walk became legendary and his riffs inspired generations, musicians who shared his stage quickly learned that Berry ran his band like a kingdom. Few felt that pressure more than his drummers. Over a career spanning more than 6 decades, Berry carried a fearsome reputation into every venue. He demanded absolute precision, treating his songs not as evolving performances, but as rigid blueprints. A drifting tempo or misplaced fill could halt a show instantly. Those instincts were forged by hard lessons in an industry that exploited black artists and stole their work. Control became Berry's defense, and crossing him came at a cost. The forgotten pickup guitarists. Chuck Berry's most frequent clashes weren't with famous names. They were with the working musicians hired locally, handed a set list, and expected to deliver perfection. Throughout the 1970s and well into the 1980s, Berry often toured without a consistent band, relying on local musicians to back him up. This became his standard practice, arriving in town, rehearsing briefly, if at all, with whoever had been hired, then expecting flawless execution of his catalog. This approach was unusual even by the standards of touring musicians. Most artists of Berry's stature traveled with their own bands, ensuring consistency and musical chemistry. Berry chose differently. The reasons for this choice varied depending on who you asked. Some said it was about money. Traveling with a full band meant additional costs for transportation, lodging, and salaries. Others suggested it was about control. Pickup musicians were temporary, expendable, and less likely to develop the kind of familiarity that might lead them to suggest changes or interpretations. Still others believed Berry simply preferred it this way, enjoying the power dynamic of being the only constant in an ever-changing lineup. Whatever the motivation, the result was the same. Guitarists walked into a minefield. Berry knew every nuance of his songs, every rhythmic pocket, every vocal inflection. He demanded the same from musicians who might have received the set list hours earlier, or in some cases, only during a brief sound check that afternoon. The pressure was immense. These local players, often skilled musicians in their own right, found themselves in an impossible situation. They were expected to replicate recordings they might have heard dozens of times but had never performed. They had to anticipate Berry's cues, match his phrasing exactly, and avoid any personal flourishes or stylistic touches that might draw his ire. One guitarist who worked with Berry in the mid-1970s later described it as playing Simon Says with your career on the line. Multiple accounts from working musicians describe Berry stopping songs mid-performance to call out mistakes. Some witnesses recall him yelling from the stage, publicly embarrassing the guitar player in front of packed crowds who had come to see a legend perform. Others describe him turning his back to the audience to glare at the rhythm section, his body language communicating displeasure more effectively than words. In some cases, he simply unplugged and walked off stage when displeased, leaving the band to flounder while the audience watched in confused silence. The psychological impact of these public corrections was devastating. Musicians spoke of feeling humiliated, of questioning their abilities, of the shame of being dressed down in front of peers and fans. For many, the gig became less about the music and more about survival, getting through the set without triggering Berry's wrath. One story, repeated by musicians in different cities across multiple years, describes a guitarist walking off stage during a performance after being berated between verses. The incident reportedly happened during a rendition of his signature song, with Berry finishing the performance alone before the chastened musician sheepishly returned. Whether this story represents a single incident that became legendary or multiple similar occurrences remains unclear. But its persistence in musician circles speaks to a pattern of behavior that was widely recognized. These weren't inexperienced players. Many were seasoned club veterans who'd backed national acts, studio professionals who'd recorded hundreds of sessions, and respected local musicians with decades of experience. They knew how to follow a band leader, how to read musical cues, how to lock into a groove. But Barry's standards weren't just about skill. They were about absolute submission to his exact vision. He wanted precision, not interpretation. He wanted replication, not collaboration. For these pickup guitarists, what should have been a career highlight often became a traumatic experience. The opportunity to play with a rock and roll pioneer, to share the stage with the man who wrote the book on rock guitar, turned into something closer to a trial by fire. Some musicians refused to work with Barry again, despite the prestige and the paycheck. Others carried the stories as both wounds and badges of honor. Surviving a Chuck Berry gig meant something in the music world. It meant you could handle pressure, that you could maintain professionalism in the face of harsh criticism, that you'd been tested and survived. Working with Barry meant checking your ego at the door. Those who couldn't accept that learned publicly, in front of audiences who'd paid good money to see a rock legend, not witness a public dressing down of local talent. If Chuck Berry could publicly humiliate anonymous working musicians without blinking, what do you think happened when a world-famous guitar god stepped onto his stage thinking respect would protect him? Because next up, Chuck Berry met someone who thought admiration was enough. Spoiler, it wasn't. Eric Clapton. In 1973, during the filming of the concert documentary Let the Good Times Roll, Eric Clapton, already established as one of rock's premier guitarists, joined Barry on stage for what should have been a celebratory moment between two guitar legends. By this point in his career, Clapton had already achieved superstar status. He'd been a member of the Yardbirds, had formed Cream and helped define the power trio format, and had established himself as a solo artist. His guitar work was studied by aspiring musicians worldwide. He was called God by his fans, a nickname that reflected the almost religious reverence with which his playing was regarded. For Clapton, the opportunity to play with Chuck Berry wasn't just another gig. It was a chance to honor one of his musical heroes, a man whose riffs and techniques had influenced his own development as a guitarist. Instead, it became an exercise in tension. According to multiple witnesses and Clapton's own later accounts, Berry was critical throughout the performance, unhappy with Clapton's interpretation of his material. This wasn't about wrong notes. Clapton could play Berry's catalog flawlessly. He'd spent years absorbing Berry's techniques, studying his recordings, and incorporating those influences into his own playing. The issue was stylistic interpretation, and it highlighted a fundamental disconnect in how the two men understood music. Berry wanted exact replication of his recorded arrangements. Every note, every bend, every rhythmic accent had to match what appeared on his records. To Berry, these recordings were the definitive versions of his songs, and any deviation from them, no matter how skillful or tasteful, was a corruption of his artistic vision. Clapton, like most accomplished musicians, naturally brought his own phrasing and blues rock vocabulary to the material. This wasn't disrespect or carelessness, it was how skilled musicians approached performance. When you've spent decades developing your own voice on the instrument, when you've internalized thousands of hours of practice and performance, you don't simply mimic. You interpret. You bring your own sensibility to the music while respecting its essence. Every bent note that deviated from Berry's original, every slight rhythmic variation, every moment where Clapton's blues influence showed through, Berry noticed and disapproved. The performance became increasingly uncomfortable as Berry's dissatisfaction became apparent. What should have been a joyful collaboration between two masters became a masterclass in incompatible approaches to music making. Clapton later described Berry as brilliant but difficult to work with, choosing his words diplomatically in interviews. Those familiar with Clapton's usually effusive praise for his influences noted the careful distance in his comments about Berry. He acknowledged Berry's importance, his innovations, his place in rock history, but the warmth that characterized his discussions of other blues and rock pioneers was noticeably absent. The footage tells its own story, showing Clapton's body language shift from eager to cautious as the performance progressed. Watch his face in those recordings, and you can see the moment-to-moment recalculation happening, the realization that this wasn't going the way he'd hoped, that his hero was not impressed, that the homage he'd intended to pay was being received as inadequacy. For someone who'd spent years championing Berry's music and influence, the experience was sobering. Clapton had covered Berry's songs, had cited him in countless interviews as a foundational influence, had helped ensure younger audiences knew about Berry's contributions to rock and roll. None of that purchased any goodwill in this moment. Your hero wasn't always heroic up close. The incident serves as a reminder that artistic genius and personal generosity don't always coexist. Berry's uncompromising vision had created some of rock's most enduring music, but that same uncompromising nature made collaboration difficult, even with musicians who approached him with genuine respect and considerable skill. Even world-class talent didn't guarantee Berry's approval. On his stage, you played his way or faced his displeasure, regardless of your resume or your intentions. Eric Clapton walked in as a disciple, not a challenger. He came to honor Chuck Berry and left realizing heroes don't always want gratitude. So if even God himself couldn't play Berry's music the right way, what chance did anyone else have once real star power entered the room? Johnny Johnson. This conflict cuts deeper because it lasted decades and involved not just musical differences, but fundamental questions of credit and compensation. Johnny Johnson served as Berry's pianist and musical collaborator from 1952 onward, helping shape the sound of Berry's biggest recordings. His piano work on classics like Johnny Be Good, Roll Over Beethoven, and Maybelline was foundational, providing melodic counterpoint and rhythmic drive that defined those recordings. Without Johnson's piano, these songs would sound fundamentally different. His playing wasn't decoration or embellishment, it was structural, essential to the song's identity. The partnership began in the early 1950s in St. Louis, where Johnson led a jazz and blues trio playing local clubs. Berry, then an aspiring guitarist looking to break into music professionally, joined Johnson's group. The musical chemistry was immediate. Berry brought original songs with a unique blend of country, blues, and rhythm and blues influences. Johnson's sophisticated piano work, grounded in jazz harmony and blues rhythm, provided the perfect foundation. As Berry's songs began attracting attention and eventually led to a recording contract with Chess Records, Johnson remained by his side. He played on the recordings that would define rock and roll's early sound. His piano on Maybelline drives the song forward with relentless energy. His work on Roll Over Beethoven provides a sophisticated harmonic foundation that elevates the song beyond simple rock and roll into something more musically complex. On Johnny Be Good, his piano lines dance around Berry's guitar, creating a conversation between instruments that became a template for rock arrangements. Despite Johnson's crucial contributions, Berry consistently underpaid him. Reports indicate Johnson sometimes received as little as $100 per performance, even as Berry commanded thousands. This wasn't an oversight or a temporary arrangement. It was the standard pattern for decades. While Berry carefully controlled his publishing and royalties, ensuring he received every dollar he was entitled to, Johnson was treated as a sideman rather than a co-creator. The financial disparity was stark and painful. Berry negotiated lucrative deals, fought for his rights, and built substantial wealth from his music. Johnson, meanwhile, struggled financially throughout much of his career, working day jobs to supplement his music income, often lacking health insurance, and living modestly while the music he helped create generated millions. Multiple musicians and producers who worked with both men have stated that Johnson contributed to the composition and arrangement of Berry's songs. These weren't casual observations, but informed assessments from people who understood the creative process. They recognized that Johnson's contributions went beyond performance into the realm of composition, suggesting chord progressions, developing melodic ideas, shaping arrangements in ways that were integral to the final recordings. Yet Berry's name appeared alone on the credits. This wasn't unusual for the era. Songwriting credits often went entirely to the bandleader or front person, regardless of how collaborative the actual creation process had been. But understanding the historical context doesn't erase the injustice, especially given that Berry himself had fought so hard against the industry practices that cheated black musicians. The arrangement festered for decades. Johnson continued playing with Berry, continued receiving minimal compensation, continued watching others receive credit and payment for music he helped create. Friends and fellow musicians urged him to seek legal recourse, but Johnson, described by everyone who knew him as gentle, non-confrontational, and conflict-averse, resisted for years. Finally, in the 1990s, Johnson filed a lawsuit seeking co-writing credit and royalties for his contributions to Berry's catalog. The case became symbolic for session musicians who had been written out of their own creative stories. Musicians across the industry watched closely, seeing in Johnson's lawsuit their own experiences of being undervalued and undercredited. Johnson's lawsuit ultimately failed due to insufficient documentation to overturn the original credits. Without contracts, without written agreements, without contemporaneous records establishing his creative contributions, the court had no legal basis to redistribute credits or royalties. The law protected the existing arrangements, regardless of the moral questions they raised. He received recognition from fellow musicians late in his career. Keith Richards produced his solo album in 1991, providing Johnson a platform to finally showcase his talents under his own name. Other musicians spoke publicly about Johnson's contributions, ensuring that at least within the music community, his role in creating rock and roll's sound was acknowledged. But recognition from peers isn't the same as legal vindication or financial compensation. Johnson died in 2005, respected by musicians who knew his contributions but largely unknown to the public, whose lives were soundtracked by music he helped create. His legacy remains complicated, celebrated within music circles, forgotten by mainstream audiences, and forever entangled with questions of credit and compensation that were never satisfactorily resolved. Berry guarded his legacy fiercely, even when it meant denying recognition to his closest collaborators. Whether this stemmed from a genuine belief that the credits were accurate, from a desire to protect what he'd fought so hard to claim, or from simple stubbornness, the result was the same. One of rock and roll's essential contributors died without receiving the credit he deserved. This wasn't a one-night blow-up or a bruised ego. This was decades of tension, silence, and money that never came. And if Chuck Berry could deny credit to the man who helped build his sound from day one, what do you think he'd do to the famous disciples who dared stand beside him on stage? Keith Richards. This remains the most photographed and discussed of Berry's conflicts with other guitarists. A moment captured on film that became emblematic of Berry's complex relationship with the younger musicians he'd influenced. Keith Richards worshipped Chuck Berry. This wasn't casual fandom or professional respect. It was devotion bordering on religious. He'd built much of his style studying Berry's techniques, spending countless hours with Barry's records, learning not just the notes, but the attitude, the swagger, the rhythmic approach that made Barry's playing distinctive. Richards covered his songs extensively with the Rolling Stones, bringing them to new audiences and ensuring Barry's influence stretched across generations. The Stones' early success owed a clear debt to Barry's blueprint. Their raw, rhythm-driven approach to rock and roll was essentially an extension of what Barry had pioneered. Richards spoke about Barry in interviews with genuine reverence, telling journalists that Barry invented rock guitar, that everything subsequent guitarists did was built on Barry's foundation. He ensured Barry received recognition when the music industry and mainstream culture seemed ready to forget him, championing Barry's legacy at every opportunity. None of that mattered in 1972. During a Los Angeles performance where Barry was appearing with members of the Rolling Stones as his backing band, Barry publicly ejected Richards from the stage over volume issues. The stated reason was that the guitar amplifiers were too loud, interfering with Barry's vocal and guitar sound. But many observers believed the volume complaint masked a deeper issue. Richards's presence was too big, his personality too assertive, his playing too distinctive to coexist with Barry's need for complete control. Photographs captured the moment, Barry pointing, face contorted with anger, while Richards walked away in his Stones tongue logo shirt, expression caught between disbelief and humiliation. These images became iconic, reproduced in books and documentaries about rock history, documenting a power dynamic in real time. Your hero, your influence, the man whose music you'd championed for years, telling you that you weren't good enough to stand next to him. The photographs reveal layers of emotion. Barry's anger is obvious, but look closer and you see something else. A kind of fierce protectiveness, a determination to maintain control regardless of the cost. Richards's face shows hurt, confusion, and perhaps a dawning understanding that the artist he'd idolized was not the mentor figure he'd imagined. Richards has discussed the incident multiple times over the decades, always maintaining respect for Barry's genius while acknowledging the sting of that moment. Listen carefully to those interviews, and you hear someone wrestling with loving the art while remembering the artist as something colder. He doesn't trash Barry. Richards isn't built that way, especially when discussing his influences. But the warmth in his voice when discussing other blues and rock pioneers is noticeably absent when Barry's name comes up. The incident crystallized Barry's approach to his stage. He didn't want collaborators. He wanted accompaniment, invisible, perfect, never threatening to overshadow him. This wasn't about Richards's technical ability or his respect for Barry's music. It was about Barry's fundamental belief that his stage was his domain alone, and anyone else present was there at his sufferance, subject to immediate dismissal if they disrupted his control. Admiration earned you nothing. Even years of championing Barry's legacy couldn't protect you from his perfectionism and need for control. The lesson was clear. In Barry's world, there were no peers, only sidemen. Keith Richards didn't just admire Chuck Berry, he built his entire career in Barry's shadow. So when Barry pointed his finger and told Richards to get off his stage in front of thousands, was it about volume or about a legend refusing to be eclipsed by his own influence? Mick Taylor. Keith Richards wasn't the only Rolling Stone to experience Barry's wrath firsthand, and in some ways, Mick Taylor's experience was even more quietly devastating. At the same 1972 concert in Los Angeles, Barry was performing with both Richards and Mick Taylor backing him. Taylor, the Stones' lead guitarist at his technical peak, had prepared carefully for the opportunity to play with one of rock's founding fathers. Taylor, known for his melodic sensibility and technical precision, approached the gig with characteristic professionalism and genuine enthusiasm. Taylor's position in rock history was already secure. He'd replaced Brian Jones in the Rolling Stones at a critical moment and had proven himself not just adequate, but exceptional. His playing on albums like Sticky Fingers and Exile on Main Street showcased a musician at the height of his powers, tasteful, technically brilliant, and capable of both supporting the song and taking memorable solos. Other guitarists studied his work, trying to understand how he made difficult playing sound so effortless. Mid-performance, Barry abruptly stopped the show. The guitar amplifiers were too loud, interfering with his vocal and guitar sound. Rather than adjusting levels or discussing the issue, Barry made an immediate decision that shocked everyone present. He ordered both Richards and Taylor off stage, in front of thousands. No negotiation, no diplomacy, no acknowledgement of who these musicians were or what they'd achieved. Taylor left quietly, his face betraying little emotion, but those who knew him recognized the humiliation. This was a guitarist who'd played the world's biggest stages and recorded with the Stones during their creative peak. Now, he'd been dismissed mid-set like an amateur who couldn't keep time. The professionalism that defined Taylor's career meant he wouldn't make a scene, wouldn't argue or protest. He simply walked off, carrying the humiliation with him. Barry finished his performance with a pickup rhythm section, making his point crystal clear. He didn't need the Rolling Stones. They needed what he'd created. The message resonated through the venue and, eventually, through the broader music community. Barry had just demonstrated that fame, skill, and respect meant nothing if they conflicted with his control. For Taylor, who would leave the Stones just 2 years later, citing creative and personal frustrations, the Barry experience became another data point in a career spent navigating difficult personalities and toxic dynamics. The incident didn't cause his departure from the Stones, but it illustrated a broader truth about the music business. Genius and cruelty often coexisted, and musicians had to decide how much they were willing to endure. Fame and skill bought you nothing. Barry's stage operated on Barry's terms alone, and those terms were non-negotiable. The concept of shared space. The real issue wasn't any individual guitarist. It was the fundamental idea of musical collaboration itself. Chuck Berry's conflicts stemmed from a worldview shaped by his experiences in the music industry. He'd watched black artists in the 1950s get robbed of credit and compensation while white artists covered their songs and made fortunes. He'd fought for every dollar, every writing credit, every piece of recognition in an industry designed to exploit artists like him. The history of rock and roll is inseparable from the history of cultural appropriation and racial injustice. Barry and other black pioneers created a new musical form, blending blues, country, and rhythm and blues into something revolutionary. White artists quickly recognized the commercial potential, covered these songs with minimal changes, and reaped enormous financial rewards while the originators struggled. Record companies, radio stations, and the broader entertainment industry were complicit in this theft, actively promoting white versions of black music while marginalizing the original artists. Barry understood this dynamic intimately. He'd experienced it firsthand, watching his innovations be copied, his style be imitated, his songs be covered by artists who became far wealthier than he did. This bred in him a defensiveness, a determination to control everything he could control, because so much had been taken from artists like him without compensation or credit. Somewhere in those battles, Barry developed an approach that prioritized absolute control. In his view, rock and roll worked best with one guitar, one leader, and zero improvisation that wasn't pre-approved. This ran counter to how most rock music developed, through interaction, musicians pushing each other, collective creativity. Jazz, blues, rock. These genres thrived on conversation between instruments, on the spontaneous magic that happens when skilled musicians respond to each other in real time. But Barry saw that openness as vulnerability. Sharing space meant sharing credit, and sharing credit meant potentially losing what he'd fought to claim. His music was his fortress, and he defended it accordingly. Anyone who tried to shine, stretch out, or reinterpret his material got corrected or removed. It didn't matter if they were respectful, if they'd studied his music for years, if they were trying to honor him. Barry saw potential threats where others saw tribute. A guitarist adding a personal flourish wasn't paying homage. He was potentially claiming a piece of Barry's legacy. The tragedy is that Barry's protectiveness isolated him. While pioneers like B.B. King and Muddy Waters became elder statesmen who mentored younger players, sharing knowledge and building community, Barry remained apart, surrounded by musicians who feared rather than loved working with him. King, in particular, became beloved not just for his music, but for his generosity with younger artists, his willingness to collaborate, his understanding that music grew richer through sharing. Barry chose differently. Whether this was a conscious decision or simply the inevitable result of decades of defensive thinking, the outcome was the same. He stood alone. Yet in those moments of complete control, Barry alone on stage with his guitar, the brilliance remained undeniable. The riffs still electrified. The lyrics still painted perfect pictures of teenage life, cars, and American dreams. The duck walk still brought crowds to their feet, a visual representation of rock and roll's playful rebellion. Chuck Berry created the template that every rock guitarist since has followed. The string bending, the double-stop runs, the rhythmic precision bridging blues and country, it's embedded in rock music's DNA. Listen to any rock song, and you're hearing Barry's influence whether you recognize it or not. But he created it alone, protected it alone, and ultimately performed it alone, even when others stood beside him. The guitarists who clashed with Barry weren't necessarily wrong. They simply encountered an artist who'd decided that protecting his creation required absolute control, and who had the will to enforce that control, no matter who got hurt. Barry didn't hate guitarists. He hated the assumption that his stage, his music, his life's work was something to be shared equally. He'd invented it. And he'd be damned if he'd let anyone else control it, interpret it, or claim any piece of it. This creates an uncomfortable truth for anyone who loves rock and roll. The man who gave us this music, who created the foundation on which everything else was built, was also someone who couldn't or wouldn't share that creation in the collaborative spirit that came to define the genre. His protectiveness preserved his legacy, but also limited it, ensuring his influence would be felt more through the music he recorded than through the musicians he mentored. The final assessment of Chuck Berry must hold both truths simultaneously. He was a genius who created something revolutionary, and he was a difficult man whose need for control damaged relationships and opportunities. These facts don't cancel each other out. They coexist, complicated and uncomfortable. A reminder that artistic brilliance and personal generosity don't always travel together. Chuck Berry built rock and roll, then locked the door behind him. Was that survival or selfishness? Tell me what you think below, and subscribe for more music legends who were brilliant, messy, and impossible to ignore.